So, introduce in a very brief way, as I've done with everyone, the Reverend Dr. Lisa Barnett, who's a professor here at Phillips, is a highly, I'm going to say it, is a highly acclaimed Disciples of Christ historian, and in many other venues also. So, Lisa.
So before I begin, you will notice with me, I tend to get a little more animated and I speak a little bit faster than some that you have heard today. So in order for you to keep up, plus the fact that a lot of my slides, I'm heavily dependent upon text and images in the slides. And I don't want you to be overwhelmed, particularly if I go through some of them a little fast. Because I have PDFs available of those PowerPoints that after the fact, I would be happy to send to everybody. In fact, I'll probably just send them to you, Dave, and let you take the mailing list and disperse those and share those with everyone who is participating so that you don't have to frantically take notes of everything that's on the screen that I am talking about. Yay. I will say that I offer my own identity as indigenous descent. And I say that descent because I am claimed by a non-federally recognized tribal entity, the Northern Cherokee Nation. They've done a name change as well since I just got an email asking to update my information with that. But I say indigenous descent because 3 to 4 generations ago, my family structure lost the culture, lost the language, lost the heritage. And so that's the identifying marker for me. So like Joshua, today I am focusing on incursions. Resistance and integration will kind of come more tomorrow. I think it's important with our topic, though, that we start out pondering this idea of what is religion? You know, we say religion, we think we know what it means, but we also know that there are different definitions and different approaches to the study of religion. And we also know that Western thought exhibits a disproportionate concern for the functional categorization of religion as an attempt to define meaning. We want to tell you what religion is rather than to explore some of those varied religious experiences that perhaps other cultures might. So you get historically definitions from great religious scholars. Clifford Geertz. Religion is a system of symbols which acts to establish powerful, persuasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence and clothing these conceptions with such an aura of factuality that the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic. All right, that's a good definition, I guess. Or Emil Durkheim. Oh no, religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative now to sacred things, those things set apart and forbidden beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community called a church. So now we've even narrowed the definition even more to what the church believes. You've got Tillich and you've got some others, but I tend to view, in my own research, I go back to a sociological study of religion. Peter Berger, in his work, talks about religion is a product of the society from which it springs. That is the sacred canopy, the title of his book, which every human society builds over its world to give it meaning. So instead of a functional sort of approach, now we're looking at religion almost from a constructionist view. That religion depends upon the culture that constructs it and the meaning that it's supposed to have. And in fact, historian Robert Orsi, religions arise from and refer back to discrete social and cultural worlds, and they are inevitably shaped by the structures and limits of these worlds as they engage them. And this is the dialectic of religion, which takes place within a complex relationship of culture. Now, one of my favorites, Thomas Tweed, another religious historian, says religions are actually cultural processes whereby individuals and groups map, construct, and inhabit worlds of meaning, and they involve power as well. So one of the first really in the world to define it, to indicate that there is a power dynamic at work. Anthropologist Talal Asad argues as well. The cultural construction of the category religion, it's a category, involves power. Useful to view religion as a cultural resource over which competing interest groups may vie. It's about who gets to define what religion is. And so when we think about now Native American religion and religious practices, many Native people, of course, link their very survival to their religion, to this pervasive spiritual dimension of their way of life. And Joshua, you kept using the term life way, and that is probably a better and more apt word choice. But this idea of religious life ways, spiritual life ways at the heart of Native identity. And that stems around things like ceremonies and stories and healing and sacred herbs and foods and sacred places for sure. And again, much like what Joshua has reiterated, there is not a single Native American religion. The religions of Native American peoples are as varied as the American landscape itself. And again, a broader term of lifeway is probably better to describe those distinctive characteristics from oral traditions, from land-based acknowledgments, from even the moral standing of non-human life and the elevation there. And places that also become sacred because of the spiritual as well as the material sustenance. Native peoples don't necessarily distinguish between the natural and the supernatural. Everything is part of the whole of the being of the creation from the Creator. So we cannot speak about just one Native American religion. But while each tradition is profoundly rooted in its emergence from a particular landscape that became America, all Native American religions do share the common challenges of life under colonization, and especially dispossession and assimilation. Those attempts to colonize and to Christianize. And you can see in some of these images down in the lower right, there's the cross, prominent. This one, the depiction and the celebration of Christopher Columbus. I think de Geyer is the painter of this one. And again, you see encountering indigenous peoples, and in the back, the cross being hoisted up. So the idea of this Christian doctrine of discovery even gets depicted in the celebration of some of these colonization efforts in the artwork. In my history classes, I have my students read a very difficult document. The Spanish, of course, believed that they had a divine right and a royal mandate to reduce Indian peoples to submission. The Spanish requirement of 1513, the requiremento, was actually worked out by theologians at the request of the King of Spain, and it was to be read by the conquistadors to the native peoples that they encountered. It was read in Spanish to native peoples who understood neither its language nor its concepts, but it became part of an elaborate ceremony of possession, allowing Spaniards now to justify their conquest. And I've highlighted a few things. And again, you'll get a copy of the PDF, but I highlight to you. We acknowledge the church as the ruler and superior of the whole world, the Pope, and then the King and the Queen. If you do so, if you acknowledge their titles, you will do well, and that which you are obliged to do, we will receive you then in love and charity, and shall leave you, your wives, and your children, and your lands free without servitude, that you may do with them and with yourselves freely that which you like and think best. But if you do not do this and maliciously make delay, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispossess them, etc., etc. A Christian command to obey, or we will destroy. And you can see with the Americas, the maps of the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, the Swedish, the English, the Russian, and the Pacific Northwest and the Alaska regions. A little bit more to see the color coding on this one of the different entities. And again, notice the French blue domain all the way up, even into Canada there, and contested territories. So let's talk a little bit about indigenous Christianity now from this exploration. Well, you certainly have the conquistadors and their missionaries. You have the Jesuits that are establishing missions, of course, in Virginia in 1570. The Franciscans replacing them north of Mexico. And while royal orders for new discoveries came in 1573, making it illegal to enslave Indians or attack them, we know that that was not always the case. What I draw attention to is that last part, that Indian societal organization was drastically different from European. Most Indian societies were matrilineal, had clearly defined social roles for men and women, and resisted some of those Europeanization efforts to change their society. And when they did, they were harmed dramatically. Diplomacy was based on men dealing with men and leaving the women behind. So whole societies were uprooted and changed. The same thing even with the French and the mission and the fur trade. Catholicism was the only acceptable religion in 1625. And that's where the Jesuit missionaries came into play. Now, the interesting thing with the French, though, is this middle ground of mastering Indian languages and cultures with the French that the Spanish or the British didn't do. And so a little bit more, and I think you see that success in the Great Lakes region with Catholicism from the French mission presence, a lot more up in that area. And then, of course, we've mentioned the New England and the Puritan Indian missions, the praying towns throughout the 1670s, and the attempts there at conversion and some success with conversion. And all of this is happening too now at a time of war, lots of wars. Sorry, I mean, all the way down from in the colonial period, from King William's War down to the American Revolution. And the solution to deal with all of these wars, according to King George III, to end the fighting between Native Americans and the colonists, is to make a public proclamation in 1763 saying all of the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains are going to belong to Native Americans, and any colonist who had already settled there needed to leave. Yeah, right. It was a nice suggestion. That's what created even more tension with some of the friction between the colonies and England, right? Because some colonists had already settled in what is now present day Kentucky and Tennessee. And they're like, oh, we have this land. We are not going to go back. And then after the American Revolution and all of this things taking place, let's take it back to religion a little bit. We often forget about, we've already had a first Great Awakening, but this second Great Awakening, roughly from 1790 to 1840, really does put a focus on social reform and redefining this idea of equality in a post-American Revolution world, right? That becomes really important. And along those lines, I'm going to go and do some blaming of Thomas Jefferson, our third president, who showed most clearly these conflicted Euro-American conceptions of Native Americans. In fact, even so that one historian says Jefferson appears both as the scholarly admirer of Indian character, archaeology, and language, as well as the planner, cultural planner for removal and later what would become the Trail of Tears. Was it? Jefferson argues, and he's very typical for his time, that all humankind has passed through savagery and barbarism before gaining civilization. He's one of the first to really hit that word, civilization. And he sees it as his responsibility to guide Native peoples towards that. And this idea of an agrarian model of working the land. Throughout his career, he expressed, again, admirable sentiments about protecting natives from white incursions, because he says that that would be a source of dishonor to the American character. But, and while he wants perpetual peace with natives to cultivate an affectionate attachment from them, he ultimately concludes if they're not willing to learn from whites or have their minds and their morals improved, then they must be removed from American territory. So notice a couple of things. If they're not willing to assimilate and to learn from the dominant race, in his view, or have their mind and their morals, right? So this idea of a system of Christian morality. And so suddenly now the term reservation, which had long meant something set aside, starts to acquire a new sense of meaning in a congressional debate in 1789 about efforts to ultimately settle Native peoples elsewhere. And then we leave it to the idea of Andrew Jackson to do that. And again, Andrew Jackson's presidency is also taking place during this second Great Awakening. And I highlight the word reforming America. In the early nation, who are we as Americans? And the idea that we have to form a new identity that is white, that is based upon Euro-American values, and get other groups to assimilate to that. And it's Jackson who is successful with Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act of 1830 that's going to force Native tribes to federal land west of the Mississippi. And it's the Trail of Tears that is one of the many culminations of that Indian Removal Act of 1830. And you can see from the 5 Southeast tribes, the diaspora now being made from their ancestral homelands to land west of the Mississippi, designated Indian lands that was promised to these Native peoples in perpetuity, which doesn't last long in white terms, right? They're all there. Exactly. Meanings, words matter, but meanings change. And you see the land loss from 1850 with the establishment of the 5 Southeast tribes to 1880 to 1901 and the division now between Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory in the early settlement. And it wasn't just the 5 Southeast tribes. Texas bans Native Americans in the 1850s. And so all of those from Texas get pushed up and settled into Oklahoma. You have the Potawatomi Trail of Death coming down from the Great Lakes region. I mean, you have California tribes coming in. You have this great movement along the plains of people all over. The Ho-Chunks coming down as well. And so there's this resettling of people on the Great Plains. A rough talk about land and the loss of indigenous land from 1492 to today, and how it has dwindled dramatically. Crow, I don't want you to feel left out, because I know so much of the context is based on American, U.S. American society, but even Canada is experiencing indigenous land loss from 1655 to today. So even our neighbor north of the border is modeling what is happening. And it's during this time in the Second Great Awakening that all of this dispossession of land loss that's taking place, this phrase, the benevolent empire, comes out. Prominent pastor, Lyman Beecher, powerful proponent of moral reform, becomes the chief architect of what has been called America's voluntary establishment of religion. Institutes, he's focused on temperance for moral reform, but it gets picked up by evangelical middle-class men and women. And suddenly you get not only temperance, but you get women's suffrage starting to emerge. You get prison reform. You get asylum reform for mental health issues. You get all of these. You start to see abolition as a moral reform society coming out of this benevolent empire. And even the word benevolence, if you look at the congressional hearings on the Indian Removal Act of 1830, both sides, for and against, are saying benevolent. Oh, it would be benevolent to move these tribes from their homelands where whites cannot encroach upon their freedoms anymore. That's a benevolent policy of the government. And that is how Andrew Jackson and congressmen are framing the argument at that time. But the larger part taking place is assimilation. And if you're not going to assimilate, then just go away. We'll remove you for a while until we need the land and we want the land, and then we're going to come after you again. And so these policies being set forth by the U.S. government to merge or eliminate tribal traditions within American culture, again, this idea that starts to emerge and gets picked up on, this idea of the melting pot. Terrible analogy. Melt into one American identity that is established by those who are in power, the dominant white race. So now, then we have a little civil war over some moral reform issues, right? And then we get to the time period after the Civil War, what Elliott West calls the greater reconstruction of America. And I put the hyphen in there, much like to reform America. This is also another period where the federal government, after a civil war, is trying to reconstruct an American identity that has been torn apart with war. And so how are we going to reconstruct America? Well, we know about reconstruction taking place in the American South. Peoples who had been enslaved are now free. Cities have been torn apart. There is reconstruction. But Dave, you hit it. It is Grant's peace policy that starts to frame the reconstruction of Native identities in the American West, because it is going to restructure Indian society along white lines. We get the creation of the Board of Indian Commissioners in 1871. And as Dave talked about this morning, Congress is going to terminate the treaty making with Indian tribes. We're going to end the federal recognition of Native American tribes as independent or even domestic dependent nations. And now the new phrase coming out is they are wards of the government, no longer independent nations. And legislation, because there's no treaty making, legislation, not negotiation, will determine the new power dynamics with Native tribal peoples. Harper's Weekly had some great editorial comments about Grant's peace policy. But as Dave pointed out, one of the things with the schools is this monopoly now on Indian souls. Different denominations were granted reservations, because that's the new term. We're going to put Native peoples into compact reservations, and we will assign different denominations to educate, civilize, and Christianize them. And so you get from this Commissioner of Indian Affairs report, you see sort of the breakdown. So Quakers and Presbyterians, Christians are not the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. We missed out because technically we weren't a denomination, right? So we didn't get in on that dividing. But more importantly, too, you get this new structure of Indian affairs. Congress, then the Department of Interior and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and then the Indian Office, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And to try to decrease the military presence, but to increase some of the economic dependency. And as Dave pointed out, it was the Dawes Act, General Allotment, that really started to break up the reservation systems to encourage this concept now of individualism, which is a great part of American identity, right? That's why we fought a revolution. Independence, individual rights. Now notice the land that you got, you could pick your land, but the federal government's going to hold it in trust for 25 years. And during that time, it couldn't be sold. You couldn't mortgage it without government permission. And at the end of that 25 years, you had to make improvements on the land if you were going to get it. And if you gave up tribal ways, you could become citizens after 25 years. And later on, the Burke Act is going to establish competency commissions to determine citizenship. Yeah. And of course, we're shrinking Indian-owned acreage from 138 down to 48 million acres with the Dawes Allotment Act, and the rest then gets opened up to white settlement. And the steering onto the reservation. This photo of Geronimo, the great Apache warrior, now growing pumpkins at the Fort Sill Army Base in Lott. And of course, it's out of this period as well. Both of you all have mentioned the educational system. Captain Robert Pratt, the founder of Carlisle, kill the Indian to save the man. And you see the images, and again, the transformation of indigeneity and indigenous tribal culture with hair, with dress, with language, and the loss that's there. And notice too, the promo pictures every night, we're going to pray. So we're inculcating religion into this process of cultural decimation and genocide. By 1900, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is opening 25 boarding schools in 15 states and eventually over 100,000 children. And Canada, of course, like Dave said, has the residential schools. So kind of the same process taking place there. And one of the things where I grew up in north central Oklahoma, we were very close to the Chilocco Indian School, which, folks, Chilocco was the last boarding school to close in 1980. Wasn't that long ago, right? But coming out of this time period in the latter part of the 19th, early part of the 20th century is this phrase. I read it all the time in the Indian agents' reports in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Christian citizens. That's what we're trying to create, Christian citizens. There's a book by, I can't remember her name, Jemison. The title is Christian Citizens, and it's looking at African Americans in the Reconstruction era and the phrase that's used for them. And I had a chance to talk to her a couple years ago at the Church History Conference. I said, did you know that this is the same phrase that shows up time and time again in the Commissioner of Indian Affairs reports? So there's something there. So part of that creation of Christian citizens involves now even more these religious incursions. And I highlight the 1883 Religious Crimes Code. It's not passed by Congress. It is coming out of the Department of the Interior, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. There's a letter that is sent from one of the Indian agents to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And it says, I desire to call your attention to what I regard as a great hindrance to the civilization of the Indians, which is the continuation of the old heathenish dances, such as the sun dance and the scalp dance, etc. So the idea that religion has been redefined now, and these religious practices have been deemed inappropriate, heathenish, profane. Another great hindrance to the civilization of Indians is the influence of medicine men, who are always found with the anti-progressive party. The medicine men resort to various artifices and devices to keep people under their influence and are active in preventing the attendance of children at the public schools with their conjurers' arts. And this is my own research on peyote is big. Oh, right. Peyote gets put into that category. When, gosh, we're sending Western doctors to the reservations. Why aren't you going to the doctors, the experts, right, with their scientific knowledge? Oh, we've talked about it all morning. The value of property as an agent of civilization ought not to be overlooked. One great obstacle to the acquirement of property by the Indian is the very general custom of destroying or distributing his property on the death of a member of his family, frequently on the death of an important member of the family. All the property accumulated by its head is destroyed or carried off by the mourners, and its family left in desolation. And so part of the concern of the federal government is this cycle of economic dependency that's going to be created. They don't want Native peoples to be dependent upon the government. They want to get out of that business. And so they're trying to push this idea of capitalism. And the letter concludes the government having attempted to support the Indians until such time as they shall become self-supporting. That's the goal. And so Hiram Price, as Commissioner of Indian Affairs, issues the 1883 Religious Crimes Code. Dances, sun dance, scalp dance, war dance, other feasts assimilating, all of those Indian offenses are going to be banned. And your punishment, if you are caught, is to withhold the rations that the federal government gives you for certain periods, 10 days, and then we could go up to 15 to 30 days, and then we might put you in prison for a time not exceeding 30 days. So all of the traditional religious practices, the sun dance, the snake dance of the Hopi people. Oh, I've got a couple there. The potlatch ceremony. And even this idea of the giveaway that has been a sacred central part of Native cultures as a means of thanks, of bringing people together to distribute material goods so that all can survive. All of those policies are prohibited. And the ghost dance. The Messianic religious movement that originates around 1870 fades a little bit, but then it gets revitalized by, I'm going to skip ahead to the Paiute prophet Wovoka in 1889. And it's Wovoka's influence that takes it from the Utah region out into the Dakotas and Nebraska and Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas. And of course, this is, it is an interest, these photos from the Historical Society really show kind of the emotional fervor and the dance that's associated. And even what we might in Western would call like the falling out, you know, at some of the revivals, you know, slain in the spirit and that kind of emotional response. But of course, it's the ghost dancers of Bigfoot's mini conju band that draws a lot of attention in the Great Plains and the massacre at Wounded Knee that occurs in 1890, where General Custer comes in. Sitting Bull is killed along with 120 men, 230 women and children at the massacre. And lest we forget, it is not until 1924 that Native Americans are granted full citizenship status with the Indian Citizenship Act, the Snyder Act, if you will. Some had been granted citizenship status by renouncing tribal ways and taking allotment. Some had been granted citizenship status by fighting in World War I and serving as code talkers. But for the rest of Native Americans, it is not until 1924 that they are determined to be Native Americans and American citizens. It's not until 1948 that all Native Americans got full voting rights. The Pueblo, I think, were the last contested within the state in 48 to get full rights to vote. Published in 1928 is the Miriam Report, which does do certain things to help. It confronts some of the issues facing American Indians, such as poverty, ill health. It recommends reforms to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and it calls for an end to the allotment and advocates the phasing out over time of boarding schools. And so the idea of boarding schools becoming much more of, I'll say voluntary, but it's not really voluntary because a lot of people were still sending their children to boarding schools simply out of economic necessity and to learn trades to be able to function in a modern society. And so I bring to you my research as a case study of some of what is taking place, because all of this taking place at this time around the issue of peyote and the creation of the Native American church that's incorporated in Oklahoma in 1918. Peyote, of course, is the top of a cactus, the buttons off of a cactus that are picked and dried, not the whole cactus. You see on this map the growing region in South Texas along the Rio Grande into Mexico, and that is the only place in the entire United States, the world, where peyote grows. Here's a better map within Texas now. We're down to 4 counties in Texas where you can get it. Peyote, when it was first discovered as being used by indigenous tribes in Mexico, came under the Spanish Inquisition. And I know it's really hard to read that, but It's a grave offense to God, our Lord, resulting from this practice. Yes. And so a decree goes out to ban this superstitious practice. But it doesn't, it takes off. The Comanche are some of the first to bring it from Mexico across to the United States. And you see the tribes in Oklahoma. It starts with the Comanche, the Kiowa, and the Apache down in the south, and then it starts to spread north. It spreads even up into the northeastern, the Quapaw over there, and the Osage, the Pawnee. But not only that, if you see this map, it takes off rapidly in the latter part of the 19th century. It goes up to the Great Plains. It goes out west, particularly into the Utah area and Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. There are different variations of the ceremony from Quanah Parker, the Comanche, and the half moon ceremony. Very traditional kind of ceremony there with native hymns, languages for hymns. By the time it gets to the Quapaw in the northern and the Osage and the Quapaw really in the northern part, you have James Wilson who's adapting the ceremony to the big moon ceremony, where the altar now starts to become more of a cross shape. You see the cross kind of there with the north, south, east, west, and Christian elements, hymns and stuff start to get added now to the ceremony. And then by the time you get up to the Nebraskas, John Rave and Albert Hensley are really Christianizing the ceremony, even placing the plant gets put on the altar that's created and up there next to a Bible. So the idea of this sacred medicine coming from Creator as a gift, to be used in an experience to help connect people with the Creator in an all-night religious ceremony taking place. Black Dog, the Osage, totally revamps, changes the setting. He doesn't want the entrance to face the east because in his view, nothing good ever came out of the east, right? Yeah, that's how. And then, of course, the Navajo people, the Dene people, even adapted some of their ceremonies. This next picture is really interesting because these are roadmen, leaders of the Native American church. And you see on that one gentleman's fan, the cross, right? The syncretism, if you will, of Christianity with this traditional Native American practice. And that is kind of fascinating. These photos from ethnologist James Mooney. So it's during this time in the 20th century now that the practice of peyoteism is suddenly discovered by Indian agents and by missionaries working with native peoples. And all of a sudden, it starts the headlines. It gets compared to alcohol, that the effects, it's a non-habit forming, mild hallucinogenic natural product, but it gets compared to alcohol. Oh my gosh. Cult of death. Drug. And now notice it's a new religious movement being talked about in terms of a drug cult of death. And the headlines are very revealing at this time period. It's a new dope craze. Hashish. And again, that cult of death. Oh, I love these. Indian office makes war on the peyote drug. Uncle Sam wages war on the Indian dope. Notice now it's a religious war. It's a holy war that Native peoples are fighting, and that we are going to make war on the use of peyote. My argument in my work, my dissertation that is being shopped around now for a book, is that it gets compared not only to alcohol, but it gets compared to cocaine, marijuana, and opium. This is an attempt to bring Native Americans into an early racialized war on drugs. by equating it with those and equating it with alcohol. We'll talk more tomorrow. I'll tell you how they resist, at least for a while. I found this in the archives in DC, the anthropological archives, even coming out of our great state of Oklahoma, the warnings to peyotists from the KKK. Yeah. But Native American peoples fight back. The Osage Indians send a lobby. They're going to Washington, D.C. They're entering politics to lobby for their right. Congressional hearings are held. Quanah Parker and others put on their suits and show up. And then you have Native peoples who are also opposing. The Society of American Indians and Gertrude Bonin, who also shows up at Congress to testify against peyote, dressed, and a white anthropologist, James Mooney, took her to task, saying she is not representative of Native American culture because she herself doesn't even know what she's dressed as. She's a Yankton Sioux, but she's dressed with a Plains attire. She's dressed with a man's belt instead of a woman's belt. And the fan that she's holding is actually a peyote fan. So he's really kind of taking her to task at that time period. And Native Americans are able to policy of getting it banned at least until 1973. But this is just one attempt on what is religion, right? Because the church doesn't say, sit all night and eat and ingest and have these mild, hallucinogenic experiences connecting you to Creator. And yet for Native peoples involved in the Native American church, that's exactly what religion is, right? It provides meaning for their life. And so those are some of the larger conversations that we need to start thinking. How do we define what it means to be a religious people? And how do our definitions of religion exclude religious practices of our indigenous siblings? So a lot there. We'll talk more tomorrow a little bit about some of the ways that Native peoples are able to resist and integrate in order to help the survival of their own practices. So thank you for listening.